This is the PlayStation 3 3D display. I bought this a few weeks ago after I ran across it at a thrift store, almost entirely because it had the box, which I haven't seen since the original in-store demos. Since then, I've wanted one of these, but a short production run and high cost has made them somewhat rare now. Since I've got it and been using it though, I think it's more relevant now than ever. The PlayStation 3D display came out in 2011 for $500. This price may seem high, but it wasn't bad at the time. 120Hz monitors were still uncommon and expensive, often over $400. And the NVIDIA 3D Vision Glasses kit only released 2 years earlier for $200. So including a display, glasses, and a game for $500 was a pretty good deal. However, there are some shortcomings due to the unusual nature of this device. This is frequently mistakenly called the PlayStation TV. It is not. That was released 2 years later to play Vita games on the big screen. On top of that, this isn't a TV. The only inputs it has are two HDMI 1.4a, more on that later, and a single component. And no, the component is not also a composite input. It cannot in any way receive television broadcasts. The original advertising even suggests that the component input was intended to offset this by using a cable box. So it isn't a TV, but it also lacks the typical VGA and DVI computer monitor inputs for the time. This puts it into a weird middle ground between TV and computer monitor. It's also worth noting that this does not have a PS3 built in. While that may seem obvious, a different actual PlayStation in a TV released the year before that had a PS2 built in. So to recap, it's not a TV, it's not a computer monitor, and it's not a PS3. And let's add some more grievances to that list because it's not high frame rate either. Sure, the box says it's 240Hz, and it will do proper 60Hz 3D, meaning it refreshes 120 times a second, but if you connect this to a computer, you'll be limited to 60Hz. HDMI 1.4 tops out at 60Hz max. The A revision just added some more dedicated 3D modes. Again, more on that later. Let's see, what else is it lacking? Oh, it supports a remote that wasn't included in the box. They also could have integrated the PlayStation Eye, but didn't. And if you were an early adopter, you only got one set of glasses. Oh, and they were also tremendously unreliable, and nowadays almost all of them are going to be broken or in the process of breaking. Whew. Man, this thing's starting to sound like a dumpster fire, isn't it? Well, despite all those flaws, it does accomplish what it set out to do. Play 3D games on a game console. And that goes for any game console, actually. I guess Sony wasn't all that confident in this thing because despite all the PlayStation branding on the box, they go out of their way to say that it can be used with any HD game console. Of course, their intention was for you to use it with a PS3 though. So let's take a look at how well it works with that. The original pack-in game was MotorStorm Apocalypse, an arcade racing game. And right off the bat, I have a complaint. As soon as you enable 3D, the game drops down to 720p. Matter of fact, this happened with every single PS3 game I tried. It's unfortunate, but you have to take into consideration that this was a game console that originally came out in 2006. 1080p 3D gaming was never really on the table. But it can handle 1080p 3D movies just fine. But there is something a bit fishy going on with the display. Notice the edge detail in the image while looking through one side of the glasses versus when I disable 3D on the display itself. It seems like it is reducing the resolution of the final image, despite reporting that it is 1080p. Without knowing how the inner workings of this thing function, it's hard to say what's going on there, but my best guess is that image data is processed at 1080p, while 3D data is processed at 720p. So there are more concessions to running in 3D mode. But the only thing that really matters though, how's the 3D experience? And to that I must reply, I love it. The quality of the 3D is down to each game's implementation, but the ones that do it well are fantastic. There are also games like Tron Evolution though that have so many effects on screen that it actually hurts to play because it's so busy. But the highs are so high for me, it more than makes up for the problems. I have been chasing 3D gaming for as long as I've been playing games. Anaglyph used to be the way that it was done for cheap, and many games had it built in. Rad Racer, Serious Sam, and Minecraft were all great games that included 3D support in this way. And for a while in the early 2000s, it was possible to get NVIDIA drivers to try and make anything show an anaglyph, with expectedly poor results though. So to me, this thing rocks, but you are limited to the games that were released with support though. Thankfully, there were nearly 80 PS3 games that got this treatment, but the 3D display came out so late in the console's lifecycle that the chances are good most of the games you remember and want to play don't support it. Now, in addition to 3D, this display has a feature that the support list is even shorter for: SimulView. This was a really cool and innovative way of using the 3D ability of the display to show two separate 2D images. However, only 6 games ever released with support. And no, you can't make it work with the 2 HDMI inputs. And to top it off, I think the viewing angle is terrible on this, so 2 people sitting next to each other will both suffer a 720p washed out dark image. Oh yeah, dark. We haven't talked about that yet. If you're not familiar with shutter glasses, let me give you a brief explanation about how they work. In front of your eyes are 2 single pixel LCD panels. They are able to block your vision by becoming an opaque black. The glasses alternate which eye is open in time with the screen displaying the corresponding eye's image on the display. So each eye only sees 1/2 of all the frames shown on screen. Or to put another way, each eye only gets half of the total light being shown. This is how most color-preserving 3D glasses since the 80s have worked. Even newer polarized glasses also restrict half of the light for each eye as well. It is the nature of the beast when it comes to color 3D. While overall I don't think this effect is too bad because the display is nice and bright, frankly I wouldn't really know. Every computer monitor I've ever bought came from a thrift store, so my expectations are pretty low. But dark areas in some games can be very hard to see in 3D. Thankfully, many of the games give you brightness options, and some even give you dedicated 3D brightness options. These offset the darkening enough to not be much of an issue, but it does mean the overall contrast of the display is reduced. Next, I want to discuss the refresh rate a bit more because this thing has some unfortunate early 2010s TV stuff going on. As I mentioned previously, though the display claims to be 240Hz, it's only capable of 60. The 240Hz comes from a quadruple speed frame interpolation motion smoothing that you cannot disable. Interestingly though, I don't see it. I hate frame blending motion smoothing, and I can't tell that it's doing it all for 2D content. It may be that the processing is running at 240Hz, but that the panel's response time can't keep up. Now, I assume for 3D it is disabled. If the display is alternating frames, blending them together would just result in horrible ghosting. On the topic of ghosting, in some games, especially with high contrast like Gran Turismo 6, I have seen some ghosting, which is going to be down to the pixel response time, but it isn't too bad, and you could convince me that it actually gets better as the panel warms up. There is something else that you cannot disable as well that really bothers me. This display always has a slight amount of sharpening active. Sure, the option screen tells you it's disabled, but give it a high contrast image on a computer and the echoes from it are obvious. And while I have it connected to a computer, I'm not sure if this is the frame interpolation or the sharpening, but smoothly scrolling text is awful. I would in no way recommend this as your main computer monitor for this reason alone. Usage as a PC monitor was one of the selling points for it according to Sony, so I felt that needed to be pointed out. On the topic of different input sources for this though, after Sony demoed this display, Microsoft realized Sony was going to own the market on 3D console gaming, and not one to be outdone, Microsoft quickly added 3D to the Xbox 360. There ended up being about half as many 3D 360 games as there were for the PS3, and they also seem to be limited to 720p. But it is amusing to me that the 3D games in the 360 can be used on the PlayStation 3D display. This is down to the full HDMI 1.4a support that this display has, which I'm now finally ready to talk about. So far, every 3D signal I've shown on here has been using a 3D mode called frame packing. This works by sending a frame to the display that's about twice as tall as a normal 2D image. The display splits this in half and shows it sequentially. This is how it uses a 60Hz input to derive a 120Hz image. Each frame contains twice as much data as normal. By contrast, 3D Vision was designed to work around needing 3D features built into the display by sending twice as many 2D frames at 120Hz. Then it uses an external transmitter to send the corresponding shutter signals to the glasses. This makes 3D Vision a much more proprietary format, and without NVIDIA's support of the transmitter hardware, there is no way to make it work. And wouldn't you know it, they dropped support earlier this year, making the glasses unusable with new games because drivers no longer support them. Meanwhile, the 3D display with its standard 3D support will keep working as long as the parts hold up. But this isn't the end of the story for 3D PC gaming. Frame packing was originally part of the HDMI 1.4 spec. HDMI 1.4a added support for 2 more modes, side by side and top and bottom. These work by sending a frame the size of a normal 2D image, but with 2 3D frames composited in it. Frame packing requires special signaling to transmit, but side by side can be carried over normal 2D signaling. And now we're getting into something really cool. Modern VR headsets have been working mostly with side-by-side transmitted data, so there's been a lot of renewed interest in the last few years in side-by-side content. As a result, a few programs have popped up with the ability to create side-by-side 3D images out of normally 2D rendered games. It's a bit hacky, and these programs are starting to die off as interest wanes, but one solution caught my eye and works in a very interesting way. This is ReShade, a graphics API wrapper that was designed with the intent of allowing you to modify game shaders and effects to better suit your tastes. But one of the interesting side effects of how it works is that it needs access to a 2D depth map of the 3D game world. With a plugin, it is able to take a 2D image, duplicate it, and apply distortions to create a side-by-side 3D image from a 2D source. Now there are some big disadvantages here. Real 3D needs 2 distinct camera sources. Each eye can see things that the other eye cannot because there is physical space separating them. This plugin has to artificially create this separation, and it lacks the unique image data for each eye, so it has to stretch out some areas to try and hide this. The greater the 3D separation, the more pronounced this hacky workaround is. But on the other hand, this is nearly free 3D. The computational overhead of the image distortion is nothing compared to rendering the game world twice. So lower-end hardware can produce a false 3D effect in games that it has no hope of running for real. I love this. To me, this is a perfect compromise. I have used 3D vision, and the results it produces in the proper manner aren't all that much noticeably better than this. Now, for all forced 3D on PC, game compatibility is a bit of an issue because of how things can be layered on screen. So while some games will look great, others may be completely unplayable in 3D. It's cool that the PS3 and 360 could both do 3D games, but this, PC 3D gaming, is where this display really becomes interesting to me. ReShade can work with DirectX 9 and 8 with a wrapper, and OpenGL, which will cover the vast majority of PC games released since 2001. And with source ports and updates like GOG, it can do even older games sometimes. I don't think there are any other solutions for 3D PC gaming that cover as wide of a spectrum as this does. Now, this abundance of side-by-side 3D content isn't limited to the PlayStation 3D display, but I don't think there are that many displays out there that can do what it does at the size it is. The 24-inch size of this thing was kind of a sticking point when it was new, but I think it's absolutely perfect. As we established, it's not a TV. It's not designed to be a living room centerpiece. And similar-sized computer monitors have almost always been designed for 3D vision. They don't have shutter glasses transmitters or the ability to decode sequential frame formats. Even if you search for a 3D computer monitor on eBay, the number one thing that comes up are these. So even though none of what this does is really all that special, I don't think there's a lot of competition out there. Now, I'm sure throughout the entirety of this video, a number of you have been thinking, 3D sucks, VR is where it's at, to which I will say you're flat out wrong. Not because I think 3D is better, which I do, but because 3D is not a competitor to VR, period. They offer completely different experiences through different methods. Even in the 90s, VR headsets were large things that you strapped to your head and had to look dead ahead to use them, while 3D were just some glasses you used with your monitor. Modern VR is even worse in my opinion because right now everyone seems to think that creating an optical sensory deprivation environment is the way to go. I'm not a fan of that and have been made motion sick by every VR setup I've tried, including a Vive, PlayStation VR, and a pretty quality Google Cardboard setup. 3D is just much less intense. Lastly, I'll mention that while I'm most excited about the ways of forcing 3D for PC games, one area prime for this is emulation. And no, I don't just mean the Virtual Boy. There are a number of emulators that either officially or through third-party hacks have true 2-camera 3D. These open up thousands more games to this. Ultimately though, 3D isn't for everyone. But for me, this device opens so many doors for a different way of experiencing games I already enjoy. And for that reason alone, I would highly recommend it if you can find one. Just keep in mind that unless it's been repaired, it's a ticking time bomb that needs an out-of-production EEPROM flashed with a dump from a functional unit. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. This was kind of a different video for me. I wanted to try the whole scripted format with B-roll cut in, and hopefully it came out pretty well. If you want to support the channel, I am on Patreon, but for now, that's it. I'll see you next time. Ooh.